Rewind. This is Dope Nostalgia.
Welcome, Tim and Jason of Dig Me Out podcast. Now, I've heard so many good things about your show, and like it's doing very well.
From who? Who are these people?
Who are these nerds that you're talking to?
Yeah, exactly. Well,
No,
we've been at it.
You have a great presence. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
We've been at it for over, geez, Jay, how was it? 13, 14 years?
Yeah. I think we agreed that we don't know if we're going to be any good at this, but we are going to show up every week. And we've just done that for a long time.
Right.
Consistently every week, hey?
Yeah.
Yeah, we have done it since every week since January of 2011. Now, occasionally we'll kind of like maybe double up an episode so one of us can take a vacation.
Mm-hmm.
But we have not failed to deliver an episode 711 as of the week we're in right now. So
for some strange reason we decided to sign up for doing even more. So
yeah, we started another podcast this year.
Oh, what's that one about?
So we are doing an 80s metal podcast, which seems like an appropriate thing to talk about. We're digging into the obscure and lesser known 80s metal albums to try to figure out that decade the way we're trying to figure out the 90s and what exactly happened.
Mm-hmm.
There's the stories that people tell with regards to there was grunge and then there wasn't, and that kind of thing. And we're trying to do the same thing with the 80s. Like, what exactly was glam rock versus, hard rock versus hair metal versus all these things. And Jay has been threatening to do this for years. And then our friend Chip was like, yeah, we should do it. And Chip is an old school metalhead. So it's a triumvirate of metal talk between the three of us. And I'm the least knowledgeable. So it's fun because I don't know what I'm talking about.
That's the fun twist is Chip and I are kind of coming from the, we were 80s metalheads. Mm-hmm. Tim wasn't listening to any of this music. So he's hearing it for the first time. So we're bringing some nostalgia and trying, having some fun with it, remembering seeing these bands at the time. But Tim's like, I don't know any of this stuff, right? So it's a good buffer against our enthusiasm sometimes, and just to figure out is this album actually any good or not?
But that's a good angle to have somebody who's also kind of learning while you're educating them about what's going on.
I only knew the radio
fresh
songs.
take.
That was it. I just listened to the radio, and these guys were hanging out in parking lots with heshers, and they had long hair, and they were cool guys. And I was the nerdy private school kid who wore a tie to school every day. So I was when I saw the Van Halen 1984 album cover with the angels smoking, I was like, get that away from me. That's the devil's work.
That was me in the 80s. Church girl.
There you go. Yep.
What made you want to create Dig Me Out in the first place?
Oh, Jay, what was it? We were bored.
It was your idea, I think.
Well, we had been in a band together for 10 years. So every Thursday for 10 years, we went to band practice. And then when it was done, we were like, Jay, we don't have anything to get us together each week. What are we going to do? And I think we were hanging out at Jay's house, and he had all these boxes of CDs. And I started going through them like, oh, I remember this. This was at the college radio station we worked at, old promo CDs and stuff like that. And I was like, it might be fun to go back through these. We'll have a beer, we'll sit down, and we'll just spend 10 or 15 minutes talking about a record. And that was the original format, was literally we would talk about the beer we're drinking and the record that we pulled out. And they were just of CDs that we had listened to, 20 years ago. At that point, it was only 10 years ago. But it kind of expanded slowly, where it went from a 5 to 10 minute episode to now hour-long episodes with interviews with artists and roundtables. And we did not plan this trajectory. It was all sort of decided along the way of what we were going to actually turn this into. So
yeah, we just show up and we keep tweaking it and adjusting it here and there, but the core concept has been the same. And we've built a little community, and they've become more involved in picking albums, which is fun. Tim and I rarely pick albums anymore, so It's more them bringing the records to us, and then we have them on as guests, and or we do like some voting where, you know, you can suggest a record and then our patrons will decide which one we review, which has brought a lot of stuff to Tim and I that we wouldn't have heard otherwise. So it's been a bit of like remembering albums and some, you know, fun nostalgia stuff, but also some legitimate like discovery of bands that there was so much music that came out in the 90s. I mean, I think that's the other big premise was just there's so much music. Like we thought, I think going into it that, you know, we're experts. We were in a band and we worked in college radio in the 90s, and like we were, you know, super into music. I think at this point we're humbled. Like we don't, at least I don't feel like I know very much, or not nearly as much as I thought before I got into this. There's just so much music.
Well, this way too, your listeners help keep it fresh for you, you know, so that
absolutely
it's always going to be an enjoyable thing to get together and podcast, because you're going to be learning something new as well. I like that.
It's
impressive.
It
fun. Yeah, we've got
what you've done.
Thank you. Hey, it's impressive what you have done as well. Let's not. I mean, you've topped. You know, how long you do this? 4 years.
4 years. Yeah,
4
started
years?
January 2020.
Oh wow! So you were set. You hit at like right before peak podcast moment when everything went into lockdown. Like that was perfect timing.
Because I had been planning the show in fall of 2019, had all the things I needed, the, you know, webcams, microphone, all of that, setting up a base to do the show. And then the pandemic hit and everybody was at home. So nobody was touring. And I was able to reach out to people who normally wouldn't have the time. So I guess that was a silver lining for me, you know?
Yeah. I mean, it's, you know, timing is everything. And I when we first started the podcast, we got a message that said, you guys are doing okay. If you can make it past 1 year, you'll be fine. Because so many podcasts burn out within a year. People get bored. They can't, like the format runs out of ideas, or they're not into it.
And people want to be immediately gratified with listeners. They want to immediately like know that all these people are tuning in, but it takes time to build.
We knew that we made it when in my mailbox, I received an envelope from Australia in the first year with a USB drive full of like 50 Australian bands from the 90s that Jay and I had no idea existed. And that was from our friend Gavin Reed, who has been a part of the podcast since basically year one. And he found us and was like, oh, Americans are talking about 90s music. I'm going to form and let them know about all these American or Australian bands that they've probably never heard of. We were like, oh, we know Silverchair in Excess and AC/DC. He's like, oh, no. And we still pull bands from that USB drive. Like there are still bands we haven't gotten to yet. So it's been special that we get to make those sort of connections around the world, which is mind-blowing, to be honest.
Makes it all worth it, you know?
Yep.
What's been a favorite episode for each of you?
Jay, you need to go first because I need to think about that.
Oh my God, there's so many. There's a band that pops to mind that we did an interview with and also reviewed the album. They were called Scarce. Very obscure. This is many years ago for us. What season is this? Season 7. So episode 315. So this is like in the middle of the podcast series. But they're just a classic story of, you know, a local band that, you know, stumbles on something cool. They get, you know, a small deal. They put a record out, totally lost to time. They break up, you know, the band sort of stumbles around, reforms, but it was just an album that really connected with me. It has a really cool raw sound. It's melodic and weird. So that's just always one that comes to mind of like, that's a record I would have never found any other way. If we didn't do this podcast, I would not have known about that band. I think we've done several on the band Failure and had Kelly Scott, the drummer, on a couple times for interviews that I think really helped. We enjoyed him a lot. He was a great interview. But also just, it's one of those moments that help galvanize our community. So that those episodes stand out to me as like, that's a band that that people who like our show, they also like that band. And it's sort of like one of those touchstones that we, kind of brings us all together, all the folks that we have on our Patreon and Discord. So those come out, stand out to me. How about for you, Tim?
Well, the interviews always stand out. Like you mentioned, getting to talk to Matthew Sweet was pretty awesome, just because he was so generous with his time. Like, we were going for like 2.5 hours, and I was like, I gotta end this. Like, I know I could talk to you for like another 2.5 hours, and he was so talkative and chill, and just getting to talk about everything that he's been involved with, which I don't. People know him as this amazing singer songwriter, this power pop artist, but the fact that he worked on like music for Austin Powers and wrote songs with Mike Myers and stuff, and has worked with like a whole huge amount of artists, Susanna Hoffs from the Bangles, and he just has great stories, and he's such an interesting guy. He lives in like the Midwest. He doesn't live out in California. He collects the big eye paintings. I don't remember the name of the artist, but there's like a famous artist who paints with big eyes. I'm blanking on the name, Jay. I don't know if you remember, but he was just such an interesting guy that I never would have encountered him in real life. And the opportunity to do that was awesome. I also really liked our when we had a round table talking about Lilith Fair. And we got to talk to Kay Hanley from Letters to Cleo, and Jill Caniff from Luscious Jackson, and our friend Shiv, who was a music director at the college radio station that we worked at, and was also the music director to a famous radio station here in Ohio called WOXY, which is like one of those amazing indie stations that was around for like 15, 20 years. And it was just such a cool conversation to hear about what was happening at Lilith Fair. And I think we even had like Tracy Bonham like for a part of that. Like we only had to record her. She couldn't actually join us, but we got some audio clips of her, and it was just really cool to hear them talk about that, because I don't know that there's ever been really a documentary about Lilith Fair or anything like that. I feel like there should be. There's so many interesting tours like that, like Horde Tour and Lollapalooza, and all these tours are famous in the 90s. And that one was really special, because also my wife went to Lilith Fair and was like, I am going to be on that episode. So she was on that as well.
That's wonderful.
What about you? Do you have a favorite episode of your podcast?
Well, I do. When you were talking about discussion and the amazing chat you had with Matthew Sweet, it kind of made me think of talking to Eric Martin from Mr. Big.
Oh,
that one, him and Billy, I got to speak with, and they're Billy Sheehan, and they're both like really fun to have a conversation with. And with Eric, we talked for like 2.5 hours. It was supposed to be 45 minutes.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Billy Sheehan's a Buffalo boy, by the way.
Yeah.
Yeah. He was in a band called Talus. That is a band we can cover on the 80s metal podcast, Jay. Billy Sheehan's first band, Talus.
Tim, we can finally talk about Talus.
I have the cassette.
We've done Goo Goo Dolls. Are there any other Buffalo bands from the 80s or 90s that we haven't
No, that's
done
it.
yet? If we do
there
Talus?
were literally no other bands to talk about.
That's
we got both of them.
Sorry, Buffalo.
We got that and Rick James. Those are all of our claim to fame is Rick James, Talus, and the Goo Goo Dolls.
Get into Rick James' 90s work.
Yeah. Did he do? I don't think he had any 90s work.
I don't think so either.
No, I think he was otherwise occupied.
Now, our topic today is very exciting because it's not, it's going off format for me, but it's important. It's an important discussion to have. And it's pretty much the main topic of rock and roll in that whole decade. And that's the death of hair metal going into grunge.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Right. And there's all kinds
the
of
myth of it.
Yeah. There's all kinds of explanations that I've come across for why hair metal died the way it did. And I was like really happy that you brought this idea up.
Now, do you have theories?
Yes.
Okay, well, I hope we get to exchange them. I feel like this is an episode of like one of those conspiracy shows where like you think you know the truth, but we're here to tell you what really happened.
Well, I think what, having lived it and now like looking back on it, it was such a strange thing that happened. And I don't know if it'll ever happen again. That's another, aspect of the show our show is as we go back and look at these records and look at the context of what was going on, to have such a dramatic change in pop culture so quickly. I can't think of many other times in history when that's happened, or at least modern American history. And it certainly hasn't happened since then, and I'm not sure it will. Like, things are sort of just like on cruise control now from a pop culture standpoint. Like, they change here and there a little bit, but like it's hard to imagine the complete upending of an entire genre and like that having a mass impact on pop music in the way it did. I mean, just over the course of, well, we can get into it, but seemingly overnight. I think when you actually look at things, it took longer than that, but it was very dramatic and very strange.
I think a lot of rock music fans felt at that time that a massive cleansing of the palate had to happen.
I agree. That's part of it. Absolutely. Especially when you look at the charts at that time and realize how many of the, and we're part of the thing that we're trying to demystify is the concept of hair metal. Because when you're talking about that, you're really just talking about a subset of those bands, the Sunset Strip sort of Poison end of the spectrum. What we're not talking about really is like the Tesla and the more hard rock end of things. But when you look at what radio wanted and what the record labels wanted is power ballads. By the time 1989, 90, 91 rolls around, they wanted the surefire hit with a power ballad. And so all those bands that were, coming out either with new records or were new bands forming had to have a power ballad on their record. And if they didn't, then they were kind of tossed to the side. And a good example is an episode we just did on a band called Badlands, which had all of the recipe for a big hard rock band, but did not have a power ballad. And that record just completely went under the radar, even though it had guys from Ozzy's band. It had, major players in it.
Black Sabbath members.
And Black Sabbath members. And it just didn't go anywhere because it wasn't something you're going to play on radio. There's no every rose has its thorn or that sort of thing. So
I really think that you nailed it on the head because a lot of people, do you know Mitch LaFon?
Yeah, you know who he is. Yeah.
Yeah. I had him on the show and we were talking about the whole adage that people think, oh, grunge killed hair metal and always blaming grunge. But he took that approach differently. He said, no, hair metal killed hair metal because they were putting out ballads, an endless amount of sappy ballads and just unplugging their own momentum.
I would go even further and say that the record labels killed those bands because I think you'll hear a lot of stories. Well, one is keep in mind, so many of the bands we're talking about and probably the songs we're thinking about were released in 1989. We just did an episode, that Badlands episode, and Tim started like in the moment going back and looking at how many of those bands released albums in 89, and it was nearly all of the bands you would associate with the genre. And I think they were getting a ton of pressure to write ballads because in 88, 87, you could start to see like that's how you get a song on MTV. So I think they were getting a lot of pressure. I mean, you can kind of see it. There were thrash bands everyone was trying to write a ballad because the record labels were saying, look, we got to sell records. We need a ballad on this. And they would reject records and send them back unless they had one. But then that had the effect of watering down the entire genre. So you got bands like kind of stepping outside of themselves to write these ballads because that's what they're being told to do. And they're kind of, not being true to themselves in some cases, which then puts everything in a position of like, well, this is disingenuous and it's oversaturated. And yeah, it was a very, I think as much driven by sort of fans and the bands, it was driven by the business side of it.
Mm-hmm. And Mitch may have brought that up too with the record label. I can't quite remember if he also included them in that statement, but I just saw an interview with Janie Lane about Cherry Pie, and he didn't want to write that song, but the album was done. Yep. And the record label's like, no, there's something missing. You got to do this. So he writes it and he becomes the Cherry Pie guy. And then at the end of the interview, he said he could shoot himself in the head for writing that song.
Mm. Yeah, killed them.
He felt it destroyed him. Yeah. Because he didn't want to be that guy. So yeah, I agree with you. The record labels were looking for something that was destroying these bands' integrity, you know?
And those bands could have said, no, I'm not going to, let's not pretend they can't do that. But that's, a lot of pressure. You're taking advice. So it's not really your money. You're trying to do the right thing or what you think is the right thing. Yeah. But I mean, some held out and didn't, and their albums didn't sell either. Mm-hmm. Some didn't, and they probably made enough money to, at least, continue, making some kind of income. But I think that you can't overstate, like, by 91 is just, we're saturated with power ballads at that point.
Yeah.
I also think the thing that people, when they think of this like major transition, it's not really true because alternative music was already ascendant at that point. You think about the rise of, college rock from an underground sensation in like sort of the early to mid 80s to gathering steam on MTV and radio, especially MTV adding Alternative Nation as a special program. And you would start to see bands like Nine Inch Nails, which their first album comes out in 89. You've got Jane's Addiction, their first album comes out in 88. Faith No More, Living Colour, all these bands are making inroads. Red Hot Chili Peppers, they're all making inroads before the 90s. They're getting on MTV, they're getting on certain radio stations beyond just college radio station. So it was almost like they were kind of like teeing up what was about to happen. Like it's more like a cross axis kind of thing where you've got the, hair metal is this huge juggernaut, but you can see that it's burning out because they're throwing so many bands out there. Like Jay said, in 1989, just in 1989 alone, there were 16 debut albums that were self-titled that would be classified as hard rock or glam metal. That's just debut albums. And then you're not even talking about your Motley Crues and your Poisons and your Skid Rows and Cinderellas and all those other bands. Yeah. So they are just throwing out bands as quickly as they can sign them. Whereas alternative is you're getting like the cream of that because it hasn't turned into a feeding frenzy yet. You're just getting, oh, this is a really interesting band. They've got a good draw. Let's put them onto the major label and see what they can do with a bigger budget, which is essentially what happens with, like Nirvana. Nirvana makes a record in 1989 for a couple $100 to make Bleach. And then 2 years later, they're on Geffen putting out the biggest album of the decade, arguably. And it was because they went, oh, this college rock stuff, that there's something going on there. And this band's got a good, sound. They've got a good following. Let's see what we can do with them. Because there was no intention of them being what they were. They were just hoping they'd sell 500,000 copies and, get on MTV.
Mm-hmm.
And that took some time. I think we think of it as like, so 91, that fall, there is a lot of major records released, right? You got Nirvana, Smells Like Teen Spirit. You've got Metallica. You've got Pearl Jam, Guns N' Roses, Use Your Illusion 1 and 2, Red Hot Chili Peppers, Blood Sugar Sex Magic. I mean, it's just like murder's row of major records that come out in those couple months. It took Nirvana until I think it was the winter of the following year, so 92, before they really started to get some heat with Smells Like Teen Spirit. So we're talking 4 or 5 months later. How many bands now get 4 or 5 months to break their first single? Like they got a lot of, you know, I think that just points to like the label believed in them. They gave them time. You know, Geffen was letting them do their thing. They were working MTV, and they finally started to get through in February, I think, of 92 is when they really started to break. Pearl Jam took even longer. I mean, I think our memory is that they broke fast. They did not break fast. That took a good solid year of them working alive. Jeremy comes out the summer of 92. You know, it helped the Temple of the Dog stuff. Actually, I think peaked before Pearl Jam did.
Yeah.
That was like in the spring of 92.
I didn't hear about them until after, though. Temple of the Dog was something I had to go back catalog to find out about.
Yeah, so that you know, those two bands, that took a good year. Now, Allison, it was interesting to me, and I can't remember this at the time. Alice in Chains was actually before those bands. I don't know that a lot of people realize that, but Man in the Box, you know, was a hit in spring of 91 before Nirvana is even released.
True.
Or Pearl Jam's released.
And Soundgarden was the one who put out the first album of all four of them.
Yep.
Yeah,
and
so those two bands, you know, are super important.
We recently revisited 10, and I think one of the things we came away with is that lumping Pearl Jam, Nirvana, Alice in Chains, and Soundgarden together is really a bad idea, because when you actually listen to what those bands are doing, they don't sound like each other.
All of them are so entirely different. Like
exactly.
it's just based on a label, like a label of grunge music, and those are the four that we always talk about as the ones. But yeah, no, like the building blocks were in place for the fall of hair metal. Before we get into the grunge part, I just wanted to touch on some of the other things that I think might have contributed to its fall. And that is that hard rockers were they'd had enough of the glam. David Coverdale was quoted as saying that the glam alienated the hardcore rock audience, and they were over it. Aging into your 30s while still talking about sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and doesn't seem as cool anymore when you got a bit older as it was in their 20s. So I think that might have been wearing thin on people as well.
Yeah,
subject matter matters.
And I think a lot of those bands were actually, you know, evolving themselves. If you look at like some of the output in that early 90s period, you know, before you can make the case that they were making a grunge album, I think a lot of those bands were simplifying visually and also trying new things. So that was even when you look at pictures of bands, you know, from like, if you look at pictures from some of these bands from 87, you see a lot of spandex, you see a lot of bright colors, right? Poison is huge. And you start looking at pictures in like 90, 91, they're wearing like jeans, button down shirts. Yes, they have long hair. Maybe they wear a bandana of some kind. Like the band we just talked about, Badlands, that we reviewed, you know, they were just like, they look like they were from the 70s. You know, they just jeans, button down shirts. They weren't doing like the teased up hair stuff anymore. I mean, even Cinderella, like their first record is ultimate glam, right? They look as hair metal as you could imagine. But by the second and third record, they're trying to just be a blues rock band. You know, maybe they wear leather pants or jeans or whatever, but they're playing slide guitar and like they're trying to be like a more of a southern rock blues band than a glam band. So it's even like, I think we did burn out on that, but I think even the bands could kind of sense it and were trying to push away from it on their own.
Yeah, they were cutting their hair. They were wearing flannel. Skid Row's album, Subhuman Race, that was definitely slight departure from what they were doing in the previous album. And that song, My Enemy, was kick-ass, by the way. I loved it.
We did that album a long time ago.
Yeah, we reviewed it.
I did like that song. And Poison put out Native Tongue, which was I thought was a great rock album.
We
So,
just talked about Dog Eat Dog by Warrant,
mm,
which again, that's an album I had never listened to in my life and came away really liking it. It's hard rock, but it strips it down. It takes away the cherry pie, it takes away the power ballad, and you get just more of a straightforward rock band. And you also really understand like what an amazing songwriter Janie Lane was. Like
oh
the
yeah,
songs on that are so well written. His lyrics are really interesting. But by what was that, 92, 93 when that came out? I mean, they were
it
dead in the
was too
water
late.
when that came out.
It was
Yeah.
too late, and it was too late for him to prove himself. The bitter pill. That's a great tune.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
So
I think the only, when we looked back at this and we did an episode, it was episode 200. We did Use Your Illusion 1 and 2. And that is really the only band that I can think of that maintained their presence, because Guns N' Roses was putting out singles for 3 years after Use Your Illusion came out. They were from 91 to 94. They put out like 7 singles from those 2 albums. They were constantly in the news, obviously because of Axl Rose's behavior, because they were always late coming on stage and there were occasionally like fights and stuff like that. And then there was drama within the band, but they stayed relevant, even though they were quote unquote, an 80s metal band. They were the one band I feel like that was able to not implode and not be dragged down by the changing of the guard. And there were a few other ones, like Bon Jovi stayed sort of relevant. They cut their hair.
I mean, they had a hit with Keep the Faith in 92. So Def Leppard the same. Def Leppard had hits through 92 with Adrenalized. I mean, they were doing fine. I don't know that that's their best work, but they were successful.
Oh, I liked it. But it's so funny because like those are the bands I had written down. How can we explain their success, their continued success, when everybody else was drowning?
I have this theory on Bon Jovi, and that is when, like, I think John Bon Jovi was always trying to tilt the band towards like a Bruce Springsteen-esque, like classic rock sound. And you can hear that in some of their singles. Wanted Dead or Alive, even though it's this big anthemic ballad, it kind of stands out amongst all of its peers. It is a much different sounding song, much more classic rock in a lot of ways than anything that was happening at the time. And I feel like John Bon Jovi's always been a little bit more savvy in that sense.
He's business minded. And also I don't think he ever wanted the glam label ever applied to Bon Jovi. And
no, I don't
from the beginning,
so
the bands that they were opening for in the beginning, some of them he didn't understand why. Like he should be playing with like 38 Special is what he thought. Like, you know what I mean? Like different, maybe not Kiss, right? So
right. That's a good point. Yeah. And Def Leppard, I feel like because they were like sort of grandfathered in. I mean, they were really a much earlier band than those other ones. They kind of had that going for them.
They're so that record though is such an anomaly, because I can make the argument that Keep the Faith is a fairly classic sounding, like a classic rock sounding album from Bon Jovi. It's not very 80s sounding, it's a little gritty. The lyrics are have some it's not a super, you could argue it's a 90s production. Def Leppard Adrenalized sounds like Def Leppard to the max. Like it is full on
with that muttling
production. Like it is so weird for 1992. That
but it
has
did
to be
so
just
well
pure.
still.
I know. Is it just pure momentum? Like they were just so big that it didn't matter?
And it wasn't just power ballads that were big off that album, actually, because Have You Ever Needed Someone So Bad did fairly well, but not as big as like Let's Get Rocked.
Yeah. Yeah, that's one of those anomalies that slipped through, that you can make some sort of guesses at why it happened, but really it's luck. I mean, you know what I mean? Like some bands get through and some bands don't, and some radio programmers are comfortable playing Def Leppard over and over and some aren't. And the new Skid Row's not going to get it. The Subhuman Race is going to get ignored. Dog Eat Dog's going to get ignored, but Def Leppard for some reason that gets to get through.
Mhm.
And I feel like I've always been curious what would have happened with Motley Crue if John Corabi had not come in.
Yeah, what were they trying to do there? What do you think they were trying to do?
I think they were trying to evolve, and yeah, that's Jay. You're more familiar with that record.
Yeah, we reviewed that record. It's one of my favorite Motley Crue records. I don't think it sounds like Motley Crue, but I think it's a great album. They brought him in before any of this stuff. So Vince Neil is like kind of on the outs by the late 80s. Like by 89, 90, they're already having issues with him. They do that greatest hits, Decade of Decadence, then it has a new song on it, but he's pretty much headed out of the band. They find Corabi, who's more of like a Aerosmith style, classic rock guy. And they worked on that record for a little while. I just felt like as we reviewed it in hindsight, to me, it just sounded like a band that was just having fun playing again. Like they maybe got rid of somebody who they weren't getting along with anymore. It's a very performance-oriented record. I know Bob Rock produces it, but you can tell it's 4 guys in the studios just playing their asses off. Like it does not sound like a Theater of Pain or something like that, where it's like super polished, and I mean it's tight, but it's
tight but rough.
To me, it just sounded like the record they wanted to make, and at that point they had the sort of leeway with the label to do what they wanted. I don't think the rest of like commercial radio or MTV wanted that from them. Mm-hmm. So I think to Tim's point, it would have been interesting to see, like, had they done a record with Vince, would it have done better just because Vince was in the band, regardless of the music? But from a music standpoint, I think that record is phenomenal. It's just not a Motley Crue record. They probably should have called it something else.
Right.
After these messages, we'll be right back.
Yeah. Hey, friends.
I kind of miss getting those messages on my answering machine like we used to back in the day. What I'd really love is to hear from you, the listeners of Dope Nostalgia. This is your chance to be on the show, giving feedback, telling us what you love, what you hate, and who you'd like to see more of.
Call us at our new toll-free number,
1-888-741-9192. Leave us some feedback. Your message could be played on the show. So give us a call, 1-888-741-9192.
Toll-free.
Throw on your Jinkos, Baby Tees, and Doc Martens, grab your Lisa Frank Trapper Keeper, and join Jackie and Danielle on a journey to the late 90s as we reminisce about the movies of our youth on the No More Late Fees podcast. Don't forget your flannel and butterfly clips. And remember, be kind and rewind.
Hey everybody, I'm Rick Campanelli, and you're listening to the Dope Nostalgia Podcast.
You watch me get Fred's Fruity Pebbles.
Who are you?
I'm the master rapper, and I'm here to say I love Fruity Pebbles in a major way.
He loves Fruity Pebbles in a major way.
The bedrock yellow, orange, purple, lime, and red. But to get the fruity taste, I gotta trick Fred. Fruity.
To get the fruity taste, he's got to trick Fred. Barney.
Yes, that's a wrap.
House Fruity Pebbles cereal, part of this nutritious breakfast. Yabba-dabba delicious.
There was some insecurities that were felt with some of the bands, I think, that were still like GNR. They took Soundgarden on tour. Soundgarden did not care for going on tour with GNR. And Van Halen was even feeling a bit insecure because Sammy said that they took Alice in Chains out on tour out of the feeling of intimidation and insecurity and trying to look cool.
Oh, wow. And there's another band that kind of survived it. Yeah. I mean, For Unlawful Carnal Knowledge was huge when it came out. Pound Cake was constantly on MTV.
Right Now was the big single.
And Right Now. Yeah.
Right Now was different than the other things that were going on. That's one thing I liked about it, with the piano heaviness of it. Not just it being like a commercial was kind of but
yeah.
Well, so I saw that tour with Alice in Chains opening. So that would have been probably the summer of 91. And I was interested in Alice in Chains. It was a very different sound at the time. I remember thinking, like, I don't I don't know that I know what this is. Like, this doesn't sound like any other band I've ever heard.
Mm.
I will tell you, they did not go over well live. Like, they sounded fine, but like the crowd was just like, "What is going
They
on?"
just didn't get it.
No. So it's funny, right? I mean, this is the album with this is Facelift, right? The album with Man in the Box. I think Man in the Box was on the radio at the time.
Mhm.
It was a pretty big single, but it was still like not connecting. I saw Alice in Chains many years later in the I think it was in the 2010s at a big festival show with a lot of other very big bands, and they by far and away like were the biggest, reception. So it was quite a contrast to see them 30 years later go from like Van Halen fans just not getting it and not caring to being like, the main band that everybody was into at a big rock festival.
Well, isn't that part of that because Alice in Chains, when they started out, were essentially a headbangers ball band?
They were.
And Van Halen wasn't at that point. Van Halen,
they were beyond that. Yeah.
Was really more lumped in with like Aerosmith at that point. We got to mention Aerosmith was enormous at the beginning of the 90s.
All those ballads.
Three power ballads off of one record.
Did you
they
see
probably
the Saturday
did as much
night...
damage as anybody.
Did you see the Saturday Night Live skit where they're crazy crying amazing, crazy crying, and check out amazing crying crazy?
Yeah. Launched the career of Alicia Silverstone. I mean, that was such a weird period that the biggest bands in like 90, 91 are these, Aerosmith and Van Halen, which are essentially 70s hard rock bands.
Queensryche was big in 91.
Queensryche was Silent Lucidity.
Remember that? That's as big as Queensryche ever was in 91.
Yeah.
But you can make the case that was a band. Silent Lucidity was the biggest hit, but I think like
the ballad.
Jet City Woman did okay.
Jet City Woman was pretty big. And even the album before that was, at least on MTV, was huge. Operation Mindcrime. But you can make the argument they were one of those bands that were starting, like Tim talked about some of the alternative bands in the late 80s that were starting to, open things up and, get some attention from labels and start to, build fan bases. They were, at least at the time, like they weren't considered a hair metal band. They were a metal band, but they were, I remember their label was the Thinking Man's Metal Band. That's how people would refer to them at the time because they did concept albums and had deep lyrics and played in odd time signatures, but they were very much from the outside or considered like almost alternative when it came to this this genre. But yeah, they peaked in the early 90s too.
I feel like the nerdy kids, and I can say this because I wasn't a nerdy kid yet, they listened to Rush and Queensryche. And like that kind of stuff, like that kind of went
highly
together.
Respected bands,
right? You had like
Dream Theater?
you had the one kid, yes, Dream Theater. You had the people who were like AC/DC, Judas Priest. They had the jean jackets. You're scared of them, and then you had sort of the nerdier music fans who were into like the progressive rock stuff and things with odd time signatures. And then I was listening to like Soup Dragons and the EMF.
Unbelievable.
Exactly. And then the other thing we should probably mention in terms of this melding of sort of, you mentioned it, Jay, like there's a hard rock, but also an alternative sound is Mother Love Bone. Like and Mother Love Bone is so key to the existence of a lot of the 90s alternative stuff. And they kind of completely get ignored in this whole thing, but they were really the bridge between 80s hard rock mixing in this weird stew with alternative music. And what would have happened if Andrew Wood had lived, we don't know, but it's a really fascinating thing to see. Like if he lives and there's no Pearl Jam, do we ever get an Eddie Vedder, being a rock star? Does Nirvana blow up the same way, or does Mother Love Bone become a big band? Like that is such a weird what if.
Well, if if the record label had given up on Nirvana in the first 3 or 4 months, what would have happened?
Right.
Yep.
Like you were saying earlier.
And then does that change the trajectory of like Soundgarden, who sort of start to streamline their sound as they become much more popular, they go from Bad Motorfinger, which is, again, has a lot of weird time signatures, and it's a much more it's a much less straightforward album than you get with Super Unknown and Down on the Upside. There are still elements of what they did there, but they're clearly writing, much more mainstream rock songs at that point. They're not a weird hard rock band with this amazing lead singer that can, belt it out. They're doing something different. So it can completely change the whole spectrum of 90s music, depending on what happens with what universe you're in with regards to Andrew Wood living or passing away.
Temple of the Dog doesn't happen either, which was a band that helped move all of this forward along with Pearl Jam.
I think the one thing I was thinking about as I was driving home today was, is there a moment, does grunge have its moment or its period where it dies? Like, can you point to, people will point to Kurt Cobain committing suicide, but it was still happening at that point. There were still bands. I kind of
put
think
a huge dent in it, but I don't think it
there were a lot of shots taken. They tried to throw electronica at people. They tried to throw swing revival at people,
ska.
Pop punk, ska. There was third wave ska or fourth wave or whatever it was. Really, it's not until nu metal hits that you completely get grunge wiped off of pretty much alternative radio. It gets dominated by, Korn and Limp Bizkit and Marilyn Manson and Linkin Park later and those kind of bands. And all those grunge bands are just done by that point. And Jay and I have talked about this when we started the podcast. Neither of us had listened to any of that stuff because we were so burnt out on 90s quote unquote grunge that we were listening to totally different stuff because it had been so overwhelming that we just couldn't bother with it anymore.
The same pattern happened though, I think, in terms of you get, maybe it's different. I think with the 80s metal, hair metal stuff, I think we talked about it getting to the point where like, okay, it's all about power ballads. That's how you get it on the radio. That's how you make it work. With the 90s, we get like generations of grunge. There's like carbon copies. So there's like a second generation of grunge bands, and then there's a third grunge generation. So by the end, when you finally get nu metal, it's like, okay, we're finally done. I think the last version is like maybe Nickelback is like the fourth generation grunge band, but like
Creed.
Everybody wanted to party again.
It starts to turn back into like, they just become like, fun rock bands or whatever, like straightforward rock bands that have like sounds that are reminiscent of Pearl Jam, let's say. But for the most part, they're just commercial rock. And I guess some of those bands also keep the power ballad formula as well, right? I think by the time it gets distilled, you start to hear some of those bands doing big ballads, and that's the songs that are getting on the radio. So it's like, in some ways, the pattern repeated itself. Those grunge bands were not immune from the same thing happening to them that happened to
Unplugged. MTV's Unplugged. Like, what role did that play in all of this? The MTV role.
Huge. Absolutely. And think about it, like arguably Live's biggest single is a power ballad with Lightning Crashes. Ben Fold 5's arguably their biggest single, Brick, is a power ballad or in the power ballad mode. There were a lot of those things happening, and Jay and I have talked about that. Either you had to have like that kind of song, or you had something have really quirky and memorable that, like, Marcy Playground, Sex and Candy, or Chumbawamba Tub Thumping. It had to be some sort
Millions
of like
peaches.
Exactly. It had to be quirky. You had to find that weird little hook that people, with bands like Cake or Eels, all those they were still alternative bands, but they were moving away from the grunge sound. And I feel like
Beck
again, what is grunge? We're getting into like, if we really want to dig into grunge, we'd have to be talking about the Melvins and Mudhoney and that kind of stuff too, and Green River. But there definitely was a pattern of, okay, we've given you all a chance to make your albums, now produce us singles that we can play on the radio, and we're going to sign a billion bands, and that sort of thing.
Kind of kills the magic.
You mentioned Unplugged. I'd argue Tesla kind of pioneered that entire concept with 5-man acoustical jam. Right? And they end up having a big hit with Signs. MTV starts doing it regularly, and it carries through the 90s. And I think you see, obviously Nirvana famously does it. And you see bands from like even Kiss, you see a mix of current bands and old bands doing it. It becomes this format where maybe it makes rock music more accessible in the same way a ballad does. Like it
demystifies it.
Yeah, and it strips out some of the distortion and the rough edges.
It
and
breaks the song down to its roots.
Yeah.
Right.
And you can also look at it as we're also learning more about bands. We're starting to lose mystique when it comes to bands. You don't have these stories of Led Zeppelin on the road and the crazy antics they're up to. And are these guys worshiping the devil and making deals with, Satan worshipers and
that's what my grandma told me. Well.
And now they're playing acoustic guitars in a circle on MTV, and they're telling stories, and you're kind of losing that aspect of, when I first saw Smells Like Teen Spirit, I was like, the video, I was like, what is this? These guys look crazy. I've never seen anybody with hair like that.
Yeah.
And it starts to break down that wall. And now there's no wall. I mean, artists are just always in your face all the time on social media and TikTok and Instagram, and it's ubiquitous. There's no mystique with artists whatsoever. Whereas I feel like that decline started happening in the 90s in a variety of different ways. And then you also had MTV covering people much differently, in the 90s. They started with including bands in various aspects of their programming. It wasn't just showing videos anymore. Now you got like rock and jock, softball, and these people are like human beings.
I forgot about that. Oh,
you remember?
Goodness.
Yeah, that's crazy to me that they used to do that. Like,
we saw some of this stuff, but like we had Much Music, so it was a little bit different for us. But yeah,
right.
But they did the same kind of thing, having the bands into the Much environment and kind of just stripping down things and having them be with the fans one-on-one. And that was an important element at Much Music.
Yeah. There's probably a book in there somewhere. Maybe I'll write it with Jay someday about what really happened, but it's such a big topic with regards to this shift that happened, because yes, it was overnight in some respects for the individual bands, but for culture, it's much more messy. And it's much, you would see the video for Amazing, and then you'd see Been Caught Stealing at the same time. And then you'd see like the first Black Crowes single playing, and you're like, well, how do the Black Crowes fit in all this? Because they're essentially a hard rock band, but they're not getting lumped in. Like, how are they different than Cinderella at that point?
And REM's in there, and just looking at like 91, like what the top songs were: Nirvana, Metallica, Pearl Jam, Guns N' Roses, Chili Peppers, REM, U2, Scorpions, Winds of Change. Like Guns N' Roses, Queensryche. Let's just take those 10. Other than Pearl Jam, I don't see any grunge. Or I guess you could argue Nirvana, right? So 8 or 2 of the 10 you would call grunge. You go to the next year, it's basically the same list, You
so
throw in
93.
You go to 93. We've got Meatloaf with a big hit.
Oh yeah,
right. Aerosmith crying. Aerosmith dominating. Counting Crows is out at that point. So there's all these like interesting bands that are very different, but not very few of them I would call grunge. I mean, really, Pearl Jam and
they're not rocking you in the face either.
Yeah.
Like it's still kind of subtle.
Spin Doctors, REM, Cranberries. It's more subtle. Indies, alternative stuff. I mean, some of these bands have been around a long, like Soul Asylum breaks that year. They were around for a decade before that. It's very,
right. Well, REM the same way. I mean,
Yeah,
REM
it's not
was
like
going for a decade before they got onto, onto a major label with a ton of money and big budgets for videos and that sort of thing.
Mhm.
like really Counting Crows and Blind Melon are the only new bands I'm seeing in 93. You sort of just look at the mega sellers. Most of the other bands have been around a long time or a decent amount of time.
And that, to me, the Spin Doctors, Counting Crows thing is a whole other subgenre of stuff happening in the 90s, which is like this return to like 60s hippie-ish stuff.
Yeah.
You get that with like, the Grateful Dead are still kind of a thing in college at that point. Like people have Dead posters in college, even though they were not alive when the Dead were touring and being a stadium act. And you get the Horde tour, you get Blues Traveler, all these sort of like Rusted Root. I mean, there's all this like kind of hippie-ish resurgence that happens. And again, I think that's just part of like labels were just looking for anything to sign. Like at that point, like any band that they think has a song by 93, 94, they are signing them and throwing the record out however possible.
They just
Blind
didn't know
Melon's
what
weird
to
because,
do.
yeah. Blind Melon had a weird connection to Guns N' Roses, so that's kind of a oddball.
But just to double down on your point there, Tim, if you look at like what is the difference between the biggest rock songs of 91 and the biggest rock songs of 93, you're really swapping like Van Halen, Extreme, Ozzy, right? You're taking those out, Queensryche, and you're inserting Spin Doctors, the Cranberries, Soul Asylum, the Breeders. Are those grunge bands? I don't think they're grunge bands. Those are alternative. You can say they're alternative bands. You could say they're rock bands. I don't know. But those are not like quintessential grunge bands. So if you just look at the numbers, like they were supplanted with different music, but I don't know that I could make the case that they gave up their success to grunge.
No,
necessarily. It doesn't seem.
Grunge was just the catalyst of the wiping of the palette of excess that was hair metal, and then I think after that everybody was kind of settling down and going, okay, like you said, what do we sign now? What's going to be the next future of rock? It feels like sometimes like they're just kind of like each era of rock acts as it's rebelling against the one before it in some way.
Absolutely. I mean, punk was a reaction to the bloated 70s rock and the big stadium rock. And then that burned out. Mm-hmm. And then you get new wave after that, which is a much more sanitized version of punk rock. And I mean, that happens constantly I don't think it happens anymore. I think probably the end of the 90s into the early 2000s is the last gasp of that happening, when you had sort of the new metal at the end of the 90s, but then you had like the garage rock revival with like the Strokes and the White Stripes and those sorts of bands. So it's.
But do we think that that's, maybe I'm biased, but I feel like that stopped happening around 2000.
No.
Where that reaction of like, oh no, we're rebelling against this thing, and it cleanses the palate and we rebuild, and then we get to the point where we reset it again. Like, have we really done that? Did we?
Well, that's a whole other conversation, because the end of the decade is when you introduce file sharing, and it's sort of the obliteration of major label. I mean, you start consolidating the major labels, and you've only really got 4 or 5, and
everyone's hanging on to survive at this point.
Exactly. And radio stations are consolidating their playlists and shrinking those down. They're all getting bought by Clear Channel in the United States. So everything is getting shrunk. And I feel like there were some shots taken, like, this is the next thing that's going to happen. And then maybe 4 bands got popular. And then they're like, oh no, what we're going to do is like Block Party and Franz Ferdinand and this. And then that didn't happen. Oh no, Arcade Fire is going to be the next big thing. And then that sort of burns out. And then it really hasn't had a thing in any way. Like, the Foo Fighters are still basically the biggest rock band there is right now, and they've been around since 1995.
There's no real
yeah.
thing anymore as somebody who's going to be a classic rock band, that someone's going to be a super huge band. Like, I can't think of anybody except Foo Fighters who really will represent that in 20, 30 years from now.
Yeah.
Yeah. In some ways maybe it's okay in that like there's less division.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that's just the old guy to me talking that doesn't want to fight about music anymore.
No.
But it's kind of nice just to be like, in our community, right? It's all, people Gen X.
Yeah.
We all went through the like liking, hair metal and popular stuff in the 80s. Maybe some of us like punk or alternative, but then we pretended not to like that anymore in the 90s, even though a lot of us were still listening to it with 90s music. And now we're like older and we're like, this is all good. Like what you like, it's fine.
Yeah.
Like we don't have to fight and argue about this anymore. And like, if
This is
whatever it is
true.
you're into, like there's new music being released that kind of sounds like that. Like there's stuff that sounds like it's from the 70s. There's stuff that sounds like it's from the 80s. There's stuff that sounds like 90s shoegaze. There's stuff that sounds kind of new. But
Right.
it's all like on equal footing, I guess is my point.
Yeah.
Which
Because
maybe with streaming is okay.
Yeah, because we consume music differently than we did. There's more room, I think, for everybody to come play ball,
Absolutely. And there's no gatekeeper like with MTV or radio or anything like that anymore. So you just kind of have to wade into the waters and figure out what you want to listen to, whether it's through the algorithm spitting things out or you just going out and talking to people on Discord like we do.
Yeah.
That's the good and the bad, right? I mean,
Yeah.
It makes it hard for bands to be successful now because you don't have a curator that's going to say, like, go listen to this band or put money behind it or promote it.
It's the money, the promo. Yeah.
Mhm.
That's lacking.
Now the fans have to go do the work. I mean, it's not easy there's a lot of music that's released. We try to keep track of it ourselves and
don't know where to begin.
It's tough. It's tough.
It is.
Before we get to the end of this, another point I wanted to make about the whole grunge cleansing of the palette. I did draw more attention, I think, from party to things like mental health. I think we stopped glorifying drugs to the extent that they were being glorified. There's a little more realism in what they can do to people, because the 80s were all about cocaine everywhere.
Right.
I think
excess.
People were still doing the drugs, but we were more aware of what the drugs were doing now. Right.
Yeah.
And a big thing too, I think that era was really good for women in music. Really good, because we stopped being looked at as objects rolling around on a car in a bikini as much, or as groupies, and kind of being more looked at musicians, like Lilith Fair, like what Sarah McLachlan did and what Alanis Morissette ended up doing. And I think it was a really healthy time to reset where women stood in rock and roll.
Absolutely. And I think that also, the rise of hair metal couldn't happen with just a male audience, right? You have to have everybody. You got to have all the four quadrants.
Oh, I loved
young,
it.
old.
Us girls loved it.
Exactly. But that only takes you so far. Like, and you mentioned it, like at some point, they talk about like a band like Velvet Underground, 10,000 people saw them live maybe, and half those people started bands. Like at some point, the fans have to get so excited that they want to start bands. And there wasn't really a lot of female fronted hair metal and hard rock, but with alternative.
Person I think of is like Lita Ford, or
you think of like Lita Ford and Vixen, and there's like a few.
Yeah, there's a few, but hardly any. Yeah.
Hardly any. Yeah. Whereas alternative, you were already seeing that. You were already seeing the Indigo Girls. You were already seeing, people in a variety of bands,
or even like Veruca Salt and L7,
exactly. And so it felt more democratized in that sense. And I know that there was still terrible behavior, it was still the excess of rock and roll. People were still having, stuff happen backstage and whatnot, but it felt like the gates opened up. And obviously Alanis having that massive record in 95 made a huge difference. because then what you get is Alanis clones. They're looking for the woman who can speak her soul onto a record. You get the Meredith Brooks, you get those sorts of people, which is, it's good and bad. Like, it's great that they got signed, but then also you're like, well, we're just chasing a trend now. We're just chasing the next Alanis. We're just chasing the next big record. But, you know, maybe that's what needed to happen so that it could get leveled out a little bit more.
Well, then when you had Britney Spears, you needed the anti-Britney Spears. So then Avril Lavigne came out, and then they needed another Avril Lavigne to market. So, and then she died, and we pretended she wasn't dead, and here we are. Just kidding. That's another
The conspiracy theories continue.
Yeah.
She's the Paul McCartney of the 2000s.
It's true. But throughout all of this, the whole decade, we've covered it so well, I think. But Metallica was just fine.
Yeah. Well, they got more commercial.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, the Black Album is a huge change for them to embrace, you know, straightforward songs, and then they even go more commercial after that. Cut their hair, but
yeah,
that sort of cemented them from like they got the hardcore fan base they built in the 80s that'll never leave them regardless of what they do, but then they've got this whole new fan base they built in the 90s by going with the big Bob Rock sound.
Yeah,
and that gets them on MTV consistently too. That's the important thing.
Yeah,
they
after saying for a decade they would never make a video.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Oops.
And they become essentially darlings because they're like not only on MTV, but they're like doing things for MTV and like showing up there, and like, you know, they saw what was happening, I think, with regards to the music industry, and we're like, if we're going to make this happen, if this is going to last, we have to evolve. I also think, didn't James Hetfield really like want to change his singing style somewhat? Like, wasn't he having trouble at that point with the high vocals? And that's part of the reason why they went with essentially a hard rock, boogie rock. I've heard people call them boogie rock. I mean,
I wasn't aware of that. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think there's a documentary from around that time, and James saying like he needed to like back down a little bit with the vocal. But that made me think of like the new wave of British heavy metal bands. Like they have just continued to chug along. Like the 90s might be like a little downturn for them, but like Judas Priest just put out a really good record. Iron Maiden put out a really great record a couple years ago. I am just now getting into bands like Saxon and, you know, these like 80s and 70s hard rock bands where I'm like, oh my gosh, these guys are awesome.
Yeah, the pure metal bands were able to just kind of like, I guess in the same way as Metallica. Well, no, not like Metallica, because they didn't even change their sound. I mean, Iron Maiden went through a phase where they changed their singer for a year or two, but they pretty much just shot through. They're just like, this is what we do, like AC/DC. Just like, this is what we do. We're not changing it. We don't care. Like, if 1,000 people show up for a year or two, that's fine. We're just going to keep doing this thing. And then they come out the other side and you have integrity.
It's so
like
funny how AC/DC works. It's just, this is it. This is what we are. Yep.
And didn't they have a huge record in like 90 or 91?
Yeah.
Thanks to Thunderstruck.
Razor's Edge.
Yeah, Razor's Edge was enormous. And who would have predicted that band would like come back that way? I mean, it's the same thing with like, who would have predicted, you know, Aerosmith would come back so big and after essentially imploding. But
yeah, bigger than ever. Yep.
Yeah.
It was a weird time.
It was a weird time.
But we keep talking about it because it's
we had fun.
So weird.
Yes. I'm so glad we did this topic. I think we pretty much covered it all.
I think we did.
Yeah.
Unless you really want to get into swing. I don't think we want to do that right now. But those Gap commercials, we got to talk about them.
Oh shit.
Jump, Jive, and Wail.
That was
I had just forgotten about that, Tim. Now you brought it back.
Oh, sorry. I know you're close to purging it from your brain, and I lodged it back in there. Sorry about that.
Well, thank you both so much, Jason and Tim, for being on the show today. I hope you had fun.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us. We love to talk to other people who are obsessed with music like us. So This was a blast. This is what Jay and I do anyways, like whether we're recording or not, we're texting each other about music and stuff like that. So it's just nice to when you find fellow members of the music tribe that just want to like nerd out on music all the time. Yeah, we're going to go and record another podcast now. We're going to talk about some Super Chunk.
Okay, well, I hope you have a great time. Thank you again.
Thanks, Naomi. This was awesome.
You too. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Social media, yeah, we've got it. Send us an email, dopenostalgiapodcast@gmail.com. Twitter, Nostalgia Dope. Or on Insta, dope_nostalgia.
This podcast is licensed by SoCan because we believe that artists should be paid for their work. Hi. If you enjoy Dope Nostalgia, thank you. Consider becoming a Patreon subscriber today for as little as $1 a month. It helps keep the show on the air and rolling. So if you want to check out our Patreon, it's at patreon.com/dope nostalgia. $1 a month, and you'll be helping support one of your favorite podcasts.